welcome to Catholica and our home up here in the mountains, and congratulations on this wonderful little book that you published.
Climbing Out of Yesterday. Just, can you give us a bit of a brief biographical overview of your story?
Yes. I was born in Young, which is a substantial town on the southwest slopes of New South Wales. My family had all been in the district, Gayalong, Bynalong, Burua, since the 1850s. My father's grandmother was a Quaker from Dorchester in England. Her brother and her first cousin were publishers. They both started substantial publishing companies. Castlepetter and Galpin, and then Ward Lock. And so I've got this 6 Irish great-grandparents and 2 basically of English. One of the English lines, the first one of them was a forger who was sentenced to be hanged in England in 1802, and instead he got sent out here, thank goodness. So I got this very strong kind of Catholicism. My mother's family were poor, very poor. They're a family that keeps secrets, and I can't find out what was going on really. My father's family were they were secretive as well. And it's hard to find out what they were doing. But my father's main aim in life was to make sure that we went to Catholic school, and he came from a family where they were always fighting. So he told me there were 2 things that were important. 1, never get mixed up in other people's domestics. And 2, no matter what you do, you'll always be welcome at home, because his siblings hadn't been. When I was in 5th and 6th class, I was taught by a Christian brother called Jack Cummins, who was enthusiastic, innovative, kindly, and I think basically when I looked around, he was the only man that I felt I wanted to be like. So I started saying I wanted to be a brother. By the time I was 15, I wasn't at all sure about that, but the Christian brothers had a way of, once you said you wanted to be one, you weren't easily let go. So at 15 I went off to Strathfield, and our training in many ways was awful. I have an impression that some of the sex abuse crisis which the Christian brothers were really mixed up in is due to our really poor formation. I think I've written it in the book, I've forgotten, but we were taught an enormous amount about obedience, nearly as much about poverty, and our whole training in celibacy was one morning's lecture by an ancient Jesuit about daffodils. And
Daffodils?
Daffodils. Well, actually, a friend of mine reckons it was daisies, but
it was a flower.
One of my friends who's still in the Brothers and is in their governance, anytime we meet, he says, I'm not sure if I've got a pistil or a stamen. It was disastrous.
Oh dear.
But given that our teacher training was exemplary,
yeah.
There were 3 Christian brothers particularly. There was a guy, Columba Davey, who was in charge of us, who taught us English. And for one thing, he told me I could write. And for another thing, he gave us a book list and said, read these. And they were Decline and Fall by Evelyn Waugh, The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy, John Millington Synge's Riders to the Sea and Playboy of the Western World, Voss, Patrick White, and a few others. And I didn't know that there were books like that in the world. I was just astonished. And that Evelyn Waugh was a Catholic and he could write something like Decline and Fall. I was just amazed. And Finian Markwell taught us how to teach. And Finian was very conservative, but he actually told us why he had voted against when there was a referendum about banning the Communist Party in 1949 or whatever year it was. Finian said, I voted not to ban them because if they can ban the communists, they can ban us. And I thought to myself, this man, well, I didn't think this really, but I realised Finian thinks through things that he does. And then Chris Harris, who was just a brilliant teacher who could teach nearly anything. And Finian Markle said to us, you're to prepare everything. You never go into school unprepared. But you prepare your religion lessons first. And if you can't get everything prepared, you've prepared your religion lesson. And St. Augustine wrote this letter in the 4th century called De Catechizandis Rudibus, which means on the basics of religious education, or catechesis, in which he said the very first thing is that you have to teach with hilaritas. And it doesn't mean hilarity, it means joy. And I used to think, I've got to teach religion as if it's joyful. This is what we're doing, this is what we're there for.
This comes through in this book, I think. The way you tell stories is there's this joy and lightness to it. I forget how you end that chapter. Oh yeah, chapter 16. You end such is life. C'est la vie.
Yeah.
And
Ned Kelly as well.
Yes, that's true.
And the post you had on Catholica yesterday was similar. You had this light thing. It's about death, you know.
Yes.
I hope I forget what the words were. Millie.
Well, what sort of value do you get from writing? You know, is there an enjoyment that...
I enjoy it, and one of the things about writing is that usually I don't put anything up until I've spent several days on it. Sometimes I do, but so I rework things until I'm happy with them. And I forget who said it first, but someone said, I don't know what I think until I write it down.
Yeah.
And I'm often like that. I write it and I enjoy the stories. My mother, poor old mum was very anxious and she used to talk flat out and used to drive me nuts. But she was also a good storyteller. And we stay...
Verbally or did she write?
Oh, no, verbally.
Yeah.
Mum stayed in Young all her life. And so when the family came back, and we had lots of cousins and stuff, Mum literally knew where the bodies were buried. She could say, oh, they're buried at Maringo, or they're buried at Cowra, or...
Yeah.
I remember the night she rang me up, I was still in the Brothers, telling me we had 3 convicts as ancestors.
Was she excited?
I think, yeah, she was.
Because that once upon a time was something that it was frowned upon. Nowadays it's like, it's like the Holy Grail, isn't it?
Well, exactly. She had a cousin who did a very long term in Goulburn jail for manslaughter. It was a pub fight. And actually I've written it up there. And I think she would like me to have written it up. She knew the stories, she had an extraordinary memory. She could tell people who they were, where they came from. I was just writing up the other day, I went to school with a guy called Johnny Regan who was a psychopath, and he ended up being shot by 3 people. His mother was convinced it was the police and everyone else is convinced it was George Freeman and a few people like that. Johnny was a horrifying person. But Mum went to school with his mother. Claire Rowell, her name was. Her mother used to bake her own bread, and Mum's mother used to buy her own bread. So they used to swap sandwiches because Mum preferred home baked. And so they'd say, what do you want on your sandwiches tomorrow, to each other as they finished school. So, I mean, Claire was a tough lady. Her father was a violent drunk, and but when Johnny got shot, he was only 29, so it was about 1973 or something. Mum prayed for him every day for the rest of her life.
Did she?
She was convinced that, you know, somebody had to, and Johnny didn't have many friends.
That's one theme that comes through in a lot of your stories is this Irish association with alcohol, and that's affected your life.
Yes.
You're a member of what's
Al-Anon. Yes.
Al-Anon.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about that. Where's it come from? Was it affected your family, is what you're saying?
Yeah, it affected my family. Mum had a sister and a brother who were alcoholic. I think the Irish, great storytellers that they are and all that, there's a kind of misery that got covered up with alcohol.
I think it happens when there's lots of secrets too.
Oh, lots of secrets. I mean, I think the whole sex abuse scandal is part of all linked into all that, and it's about, if you don't tell the, I think Mark Twain said, if you're a liar, you've got to remember what you said. And I think the church just lied, and our families lied. They covered up and covered up and covered up, and so many people got crushed by it. In a country town, we knew that one of the priests was an alcoholic. You'd walk past the pub at 10 o'clock in the morning and he'd be waiting outside the door.
Yeah.
Now, everyone knew that.
Yeah.
But they said, well, other people are alcoholics as well. They could cope with that, even though they didn't think it was a good idea. I think they could have coped with knowing that people had gone to jail.
It was all about trying to keep the good name of the church, and what it's done, of course, is the exact opposite.
Well, I think also there was an enormous amount of fear. I mean, I remember we got our first refrigerator when I was about 5, and I remember my father having to come home from work early to sign for it, because Mum couldn't sign for it.
Oh, right.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Now, I think my mother was terrified, I was terrified, that if something happened to my father, we'd be left in the lurch. She had no qualifications. She'd been a domestic in hotels and at the hospital. I think poverty and alcohol were just the bane
They're
of...
bedfellows almost,
Yes,
aren't
yeah,
they?
yeah. And I think fear... I was just saying to someone the other day, I spent all my childhood praying for a happy death. Imagine being 6 praying for a happy death. Now,
That's a curious thing. My father, who used to say his rosary every day, you know, the last decade was this praying for a happy death. Yeah, I had never really thought about it until recently, but I wondered where that came from.
well, I think
it's deep in Catholic.
it's deep in Irish Catholicism, certainly. I mean, until, well, I knew a girl my age, she was 12, died of polio. In country towns, when someone gets killed on a farm or whatever, you know them. We were surrounded by death. I think the problem was, well, I mean, being dead's not a good idea, but I don't think. But when I was a small child, I was really angry with God for making me without asking my permission.
You did write about it.
And now I have to go on forever and ever and ever.
Yes.
And for me, someone saying to me, but you'll be eternally happy, that's no consolation.
No.
Now, years ago now, a friend said to me, you must have been very unhappy at the time and you thought unhappiness would go on forever. And that's right. I think
Didn't it have a particular meaning? You know, a happy death. What did it actually mean?
A happy death meant that the priest got there in time and anointed you.
You were shriven of all your sins,
Well,
and you could then enjoy.
I can remember I
reward.
was 3 when we changed houses, so it's before I turned 3. I remember my father coming home from work and saying to my mother about Mum's sister-in-law who was dying of cancer, she was anointed this morning. Now that meant she'll be dead this afternoon, because they used to anoint people until
That's
the very
right,
last
until
minute.
it was the very last thing, that's right. In case they had an impure thought.
Yes, in case they committed another mortal sin before they died.
That's right.
I think this extraordinary thing about sin, and I mean, we were told very clearly there is no light matter when it comes to sex. Any thought, word, deed, act or omission is mortally sinful.
Yeah.
And I was a bit, too simple to think, but someone said to me a few years ago now, you know, a 55-year-old man in the 1950s seeing a pretty woman going past and thinking, gosh, that's a mortal sin? I mean, that's bizarre.
You make the point that a lot of people, particularly young people today, simply don't believe, you know, a lot of the things we were brought up to believe that you had to believe on pain of mortal sin and death.
Yeah, they just think you're mad.
I think one thing you specifically mentioned is missing Mass on Sundays. You know, that was the...
Well, exactly.
Yeah. Now, what brought about that change? When did people start losing confidence that the bishops and priests knew what they're talking about when they taught us all that stuff?
I think Humane Vitae was profoundly influential in 1968. I was a brother at the time. I was doing part-time uni after school, and I came out of a lecture and a guy I knew a bit said to me, "Your boss dropped a bombshell this morning." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he told me what had happened, and I had no opinion because I didn't know anything.
Yeah.
And but this was in Canberra, and 3 of the MSC priests wrote a letter to the Canberra Times disagreeing with it, and I think there were 3. And that was on the whatever day it was. On the Sunday, there was a letter read in every parish condemning these 3 guys and agreeing with the Pope. But all of a sudden, people were standing up in the church telling Father to pull his head in. There were all sorts of extraordinary things. I think that Catholics up till then, a lot of them, weren't well educated. There were a whole lot of things they knew nothing about. If they were told that Our Lady was assumed body and soul into heaven, they said, "Oh yeah, that's all right." If they were told that she'd been conceived free of original sin, they said, "Oh, I suppose so, that's all right." But they knew a bit about sex. My mother was one of the most pious people you'd ever meet. My father was more pious, really, but she had me an ectopic pregnancy that nearly killed her. My brother and sister, a miscarriage. I was standing beside her, I was about 5, and I heard her say, "I'm bleeding, I'm hemorrhaging." And I didn't know what it meant. For years, the word terrified me. Then she had 2 stillbirths. So most of my childhood, I occasionally say I'm the eldest of 7 pregnancies. Most of my childhood, Mum was in hospital for something, having just lost a baby or having a hysterectomy eventually. And we had a...
Well, that was the Catholic contraception, wasn't
Catholic,
it? You had a hysterectomy.
Well, Catholic contraception was either having a hysterectomy or making sure he was too drunk to be able to have sex. My mother, the local Catholic doctor, said to her, "What do you think of the pill, Peg?" And she said it would have been very helpful in my case. And actually, you were saying before, Mum learnt from her daughter. And for some reason, I've always learnt from the people I'm teaching. My first class in 1964 at Bondi Beach, there was a boy in the class called James. His father had played 5/8 in the Wallabies. And when I first called the roll, I said, "James Tate," and he said, "Jim." Oh. So the next year I had a boy called James Murphy. So I said, "Jim Murphy," and he told me just as clearly, "James." And as a 16-year-old, one of the brothers told me that Graham's a stupid name.
Oh,
So
isn't that a terrible thing?
Yes. So I'd always had this, well, from then on anyway, I'd had this feeling of, I didn't call me Graham. My parents called me Graham. It's not my fault. And eventually I came to like the name. But I found, I used to lecture in ethics to students, student teachers, and I used to use that as an example, that you never make fun of a kid's name.
No.
You never make fun of anything about them.
No.
The fact that their parents aren't married or their parents are whatever, and it's more complicated even now, it's none of your business. You're there to teach that kid, and you're there to teach that class. And actually that's one of my basic philosophy things. You're teaching that class in front of you now, so you have to teach them. And I compare these conservative Catholics with the people at Sovereign Hill in Ballarat. In Ballarat, they've rebuilt a village full of 19th century shops and stuff, and people get dressed up and come and pretend that it's the 19th century in Sovereign Hill. But they drive there and back. They go home to their partner, who might be gay or not. They have their kids inoculated so they won't get tetanus. They've got a smartphone, etc. So they pretend they're living in the 19th century, but they won't give up.
Not really.
They're not really. Now, trying to go back to the 40s or the 50s, or for God's sake, the medieval period. In the medieval period in England, people had a life expectancy of 35.